if you want to learn how I modify my mitten pattern to have a snap out lining instead of a sewn in lining, then watch this video because I will teach you what I do. So if you have made my fur mitten pattern before, then you know that the lining pattern piece is intended to stick out about 1/2 inch beyond the fur pattern piece, and that allows you to attach the binding to the fur and then fold it over that lining and stitch it to the lining. If you want to make the snap out version of the mitten linings, then the lining is going to need to stick out farther beyond the edge of the fur. So all you need to do is add 1/2 inch to the thumb lining piece and the back of the mitten lining piece, 1/2 inch along the bottom, follow that curve, and just go straight down from the sides. And then you cut out those pieces out of your lining fabric, and you can see that straight edge. So this is going to extend 1 inch past the fur edge of the mitten so that we can do a snap out lining. So you modify the thumb pieces and the back pieces, but you don't need to do anything to change the palm pieces. So to sew the removable lining for the mittens, you need to do the binding on the bottom a little bit differently. You need to measure the bottom of one of the fur pieces and then subtract the seam allowance, which is 1/8 of an inch on either side. So you subtract 1/4 inch and that will give you, and then multiply by 2, and that will give you the circumference of the inside of the mitten once it's sewn together. So in this case, this measured 9 3/4 inches, so I took off 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on either side, bringing it down to 9 1/2. Times 2 is 19, so 19 inches, but I want to sew this together into a circle before I sew it onto the mittens. So then I need to add back 1/2 inch of seam allowance on each end, which ends up adding a total of 1 inch to the piece of twill tape. So 20 inches long altogether for the bottom of the size large mittens. So I'm going to sew these into a loop, and then I'm going to flatten out the seam allowance and sew that down so it looks neater. And I'm going to sew that on my regular sewing machine. So I just finished sewing this up. So I did a regular seam where you put the ends together, sew across with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I sewed, it's hard to see because it's black on black, then I sewed lines back and forth to tack the seam allowance down, and that way it looks neat on both sides. And this side is going to be the right side, the side that shows. So now I'm just gonna sew these around the bottom edge of the mittens. I've sewn the twill tape binding onto the bottom of the mitten, and next I'm going to sew the twill tape onto the lining, and I'm going to sew it onto the wrong side of the lining all the way around in a circle. And I'm not going to measure it. I'm just going to start on one edge, the edge closest to the edge, and go all the way around and just feed extra ribbon as I need it. And then once I get back to the start, I'm gonna cut off the end of the ribbon, fold it so I have a nice finished edge, and then sew up along that folded edge, and then resume sewing along the top edge. And that'll give it a nice finished look and an anchor to support the snaps that we're going to put in. And this, just to get started, I used some glue to glue down the start of the twill tape and my label. Otherwise the label wants to shift as you sew. So especially because I have logo label and then a size and then a hand wash only for the lining. So that'll keep everything secure while I'm sewing. So now that twill tape is sewn all the way around the lining. You can see where I folded over the raw edge there and sewed that down. So now you can install snaps, which I already did on this one. So you can see how nicely the lining fits in there. And I do 2 snaps on the bottom and 2 snaps on the top. It holds it in there well, and then comes right out when you want it to come out. That way you can hand wash the liners if they need to be washed, or if you're doing something and your hands get sweaty, or ice fishing and your hands get lake water on them or fish slime on them. You can take the liners out to dry separate from the mittens. So now the snap out liners are done. Mittens are ready to go, just in time for spring. But if you want to learn how to sew your own pelts, you can check out my fur mitten pattern, and I have some other patterns available for sale on my website. And I'm also teaching some fur sewing classes this year. The mitten class is at the end of April. You can check my website for the other classes and dates. And then also you can watch full video tutorials on my YouTube channel. I do have a full tutorial available for how to make fur mittens with a sewn-in lining using my pattern on YouTube. So check those out. Tell me what you think.